Hey everybody, and we are coming at you live. We're actually, Hal is going to be coming at you live from the California Photo Festival. He'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a second. And the session that he's going to be presenting to his live audience as well as us at the same time is Totally Topaz, Image Optimization with the World's Best Plugins. Hal is the director and lead instructor of Light Photographic Workshops in Los Osos, California. He instructs all levels of photography, Lightroom, Photoshop, and his workshops and photo tours are recognized around the world as incredible learning experiences. He's also recently released Pocket Checklist, and it's the ultimate photography field guide, so definitely check that out, and I'll be giving you all the information to follow Hal at the end of the session as well. Okay, Hal, you should be seeing that pop up on your screen.
So I'd like to thank everybody for watching online. I've got a live audience here with me at California Photo Fest in Los Osos. A gorgeous day outside, and they're spending it here with me talking about Topaz. One of the things we were chatting about before we started was kind of the name of this webinar, the Totally Topaz. It's something that maybe on the surface sounds a little bit cheesy, but I find it to be more and more true in my workflow that this is all I'm using. The Topaz plugin suite is giving me what I need. You know, a lot of the stuff that we could do with the plugins, could I do some of that stuff in Photoshop and Lightroom? Absolutely. But the only gotcha is that I would spend substantially more time doing it. It would not be nearly as efficient. If I can get the job done in an effective and efficient manner with the plugin, I'll typically do that. So what I'd like to do is just share a couple of my workflow tips today, a couple of my favorite Topaz plugins, and show you how I might go in and work on some of the images that you see on the screen here. So I have a little bit of a couple of different types, some HDR, a lot of landscape, some wildlife, Alaska stuff. So I'm going to start with this little pelican. So here on the coast of California, every now and again we get these schools of fish come in. We have these feeding frenzies, and I happened to be out in Morro Bay when one of these frenzies was happening, and there were literally, I don't know, 5,000 to 10,000 brown pelicans diving, and this guy here dropped in front of me, literally filling the frame right in front of me. And so I have this kind of neat shot of a pelican. And I've done a little bit of this work to this image already inside of Lightroom. It's just the basic tonal adjustments, a little bit of input sharpening. But if I want to take this image a bit further, I'm going to turn straight away to my workflow inside of Photoshop. And although I can launch most of my Topaz plugins from Lightroom, I prefer to do that in Photoshop because I get some additional masking if I don't have that in a specific plugin. I also have opacity and layer blend modes that I can play with for every single plugin. So my first step, always with an image, I'm going to take that and duplicate my background layer. And for me, one of the first things that I do, and it's a plugin, as I was telling everybody here, there are very few things that I say everybody doing photography has to own, but one of those things is Topaz Clarity. So I'll make that additional layer, call it Topaz Clarity. We'll come up and launch the plugin. Now, Clarity I found to be just really quite incredible. And it was cool that I learned about Clarity when I was out visiting Nicole running a workshop there in Addison. She showed me, hey, I've got this new thing. And it turned out to be something really pretty impressive. And I'm using it now on almost every single image. Nature, landscape, wildlife, HDR, portrait, studio, whatever it is, Clarity has a way that I can go in and make some adjustments. Once again, I could do all this in other programs, but this is just so easy. What I like about all of the Topaz plugins is that I have a fairly uniform interface with all of my collections and presets over on the left. I have a content area in the middle where I can really examine my image, whether it's a fit view or one-to-one. And then all of my detailed adjustments I can make over here on the right. So if a plugin, if a preset doesn't get me where I need to be, I can always go in and move a specific slider to get to that spot. So I'm going to go ahead and reset everything here. And I like starting with the presets. For most of what I shoot, the presets are covered. So look in here, you know, this, I'll generally call it that it's a nature shot. And they have these amazing plugins. I shoot a lot of birds. There's this one called Fur and Feathers. And so if I hit that Fur and Feathers, that's going to get me to a great starting point. Now, I could do other ones. You know, this is a bird. Maybe I'll try that second Fur and Feathers. Perhaps the hummingbird wings. I think those might be just a little bit heavy for what I'm looking for. But I kind of like the fur and feathers one. And I'm a big believer that the only way you can really assess how one of your adjustments is working is if you go in and give yourself a before and after. So I'll fill the screen with my image, just clicking either the space bar or with my cursor in the image. Click and hold your left mouse button. There's the before. And that's going to come to here the after. So just turning it on and off, that toggle before and after really is going to allow me to see, do I like what I'm doing? Now, another technique that I like to use is we sometimes get lulled into looking at our content area strictly in the fit view, where I'm looking at the entire image, and it's kind of like a forest for the trees kind of thing. You know, the whole forest is looking good, but how do the trees look? When you're going in adjusting with clarity, detail, some of the other Topaz plugins, make sure you look at a little more detailed level. So I'd like to go in, hitting into the one-to-one view, and I'm going to do that exact same process. I'm going to go into the detailed areas of the image, toggling on and off, and seeing, all right, the preset got me to a pretty good position. Do I need to go in now and adjust anything over on the right panel? So looking at this, I find perhaps it's just a little bit heavy. So I come over, launch my right panel, my fur and feathers preset. I'm going to pull back that micro contrast off just a hint. Now giving myself a before and after again. I like that a little bit better. So I'm going to hit OK. I'll go back to the fit view first. And that's my first adjustment. Now, I spent just a few minutes talking about that here. In practice, that whole process would take me about 20 seconds, maybe even less than that. As you're first learning Topaz Clarity or some of the other plugins, there are so many presets. Spend a little time playing around with them and seeing what's there. Once you start to build your experience, you're going to know which preset to go to relatively fast, and it's going to give you a great starting point. When you examine at the one-to-one level, if it works for you, you might not need to go any further. If you do, spend a little more time playing over with the right panel and seeing what each of the individual controls do. But for me, I like where this is, and in fact, I like the adjustment for the entire image. For those that have watched me do webinars before, you know that I'm a big believer in targeting adjustments, where if I make an adjustment to an image, I very rarely will apply it to the entire image. This is one of those times where I really like the adjustment to the entire image, because not only does that clarity adjustment, toggling the Photoshop layer visibility icon on and off, not only does it pop the pelican, but it also gives me just a little more texture in the water, and that's something I think makes the image overall a bit more interesting. So my first step, and the reason I really believe that Clarity is a must-have plugin, is once I've done my basic adjustments, the global and even some local stuff inside of Lightroom's Develop module or Adobe Camera Raw, I can get in and use those Clarity sliders, as well as potentially my HSL sliders in Clarity also, to amp that image up just a little bit more. Now, since I've done this, what I kind of notice about the image is that I find there's a little color cast here. And I could use a Topaz plugin to handle that, but instead I'm going to color correct this image just real quick like here. So one of my favorite tricks for color correction, and you'll see any color cast, and that's when your neutrals aren't neutral, you'll see that a little more easily once you've made a clarity adjustment or possibly done some additional contrast boost. But to fix it, because I'm thinking it's kind of blue, what I like to do real quick, and this is a fairly rough way to do it, but it's fairly accurate, is I'm going to create a quick copy of my background layer. And then I'm going to go up to, inside of Photoshop, Filter, Blur, and Average. And this will average out the entire image, and usually it's going to be gray, but there's some type of color cast. The trick to get this to correct the overall color cast of the image is to come in and add a curve adjustment layer. And then with that curve adjustment, click onto your gray point dropper, and then set a new gray point inside of that blur. That's all you need to do with the curve. If you're afraid of curves, no worries. You get one eyedropper and click. So showing you before and after just on the blur, we go from kind of blue to kind of gray. The next step, take your blurred background layer and throw it away. So now I have this color correction on my Pelican. Now, since I didn't do that initially, I could take that layer and easily put it up here on top of my clarity so that everything is good to go with the clarity taken into account. Now, I kind of did that out of order for a reason, just to show that sometimes you're going to find yourself there as you make adjustments with clarity, contrast, or topaz detail, that you start to see that color cast popping out just a little bit more. So I'm going to leave that layer correcting the color cast up at the top. I want to push further into our image optimization. Now, where I'd like to go next is I'm a big believer in using something that is called high radius, low amount sharpening. And sharpening, I find, comes in 3 flavors. And those 3 flavors are input sharpening, content sharpening, and output sharpening. And the content sharpening typically has very little to do with fine detail, but instead allows me to build shape and form into my image. Why I'm thinking that on an image like this is that although the bird is very detailed and the water is kind of flat behind, I'd like to pop the bird off into a more 3-dimensional feel. And the best way to do that is to build shape and form with high radius, low amount sharpening. A great way to do that is to come right here in the Topaz Detail. So I'm going to create a new layer, name it Detail, go to my filter, choosing Detail 3, one of my favorites. It's a go-to on just about every image. And as it's loading and analyzing the image, this is one where you'll notice that the layout is pretty much the same. Everything over here on the left, I've got a lot of presets. Content area in the center, controls over on the right. Most of the time when I use detail, I don't use the presets. Instead, I'm going to come in and take control of what it is that I want to change. So when I'm looking at something like a high radius, low amount sharpening effort here to build shape and form, the place that I don't want to go is to the small details or small details boost. This here is about fine detail, and fine detail is really more of an input or an output sharpening type of effort. And typically I would never include that in a master file like I have here. Now when I get down to medium and large details, these things here are at a little bit higher radius. And technically that might not be the exact way to talk about what's going on inside of detail, but in the sharpening world, that would be a great way to describe it, a high radius, low amount. So I'm going to take my medium details and begin to push those up just a little bit. This is another place where you really may want to go in and take a look at your one-to-one view and see what's going on inside the image. That fit view is nice, but it doesn't give you the full story of what's going on. What I found is that if you don't get in and look at one-to-one, you may end up being a little heavy-handed, and then it sometimes gets difficult to go backwards and reduce some of what you've done. So with this detail here, I'm trying to build a little shape and form in the bird. What that means is I'm not so concerned about fine details, but I'm looking at bigger stuff. Big feather-to-feather transition, how it looks when the wing transitions back into the tail end of the bird, or the tail goes into the water. Once I'm done with medium, I'll also go up to the large details and push that up just a little bit. The beautiful thing, or one of the beautiful things about detail and all the Topaz plugins, is that they're non-destructive, so I can play with them. If I say, you know, what are the large details in the image? What happens when I move this around? Go ahead and take that dial or control and throw it all the way to the right. That right there is probably overdone, at least for the effect I'm going for. If you want that, you can easily get it here. But that large detail slider, if I swing it from extreme to extreme, it shows me really what is possible with the slider and what part of the image I'm going to be affecting. So I'm going to take those large details, I want to push them up just a little bit. Once again, giving myself a before and after with that exact same technique that I did before. I think, you know what, I'd like just a little bit more in the large detail. And if you look at that before and after, it may be somewhat difficult to see passing over the webinar, but I get more shape and form built into the bird. Now this is one of those times I'm also getting shape and form built into the water behind the bird, which kind of hurts my overall effort. So what I like to do is once I get to a point where I have my high radius, low amount sharpening taken care of, or content sharpening taken care of with Topaz Detail, I'll hit OK and bring this right back to Photoshop. Detail is one of those things that I will always target, making sure that the detail that I've put in, whether it's high radius, low amount, or even using the small detail slider when I do output sharpening before I print, I always make sure that is targeted. In fact, I always talk to there are two golden rules of sharpening. The first is that if in doubt, under sharpen. And the second golden rule of sharpening, maybe the silver rule of sharpening, is all sharpening should be targeted. There are places it belongs, there are places it does not. So for our example here, where I'm really looking is on I want it on the bird and not on the water. So the way we would do that, of course, is just going in and adding a mask. Now there are a lot of ways to do this, and on a bird like this, it's relatively easy to use some of Photoshop's tools to come in and maybe make a selection of that bird. Now, although this one's relatively easy inside of Photoshop, you're going to find that there are certain times you work this type of sharpening where it's not necessarily as easy as just dragging around your quick selection tool. Once I had that selection, I could go in and add a mask, and I have that high radius, low amount sharpening affecting only the bird, so that bird effectively pops off of the flatter water background. This is very effective on an illuminated display, so your laptop, your iPad, your phone, whatever it might be, but it's even more effective if you're making prints. You go in and you take that print that's a flat piece of paper, it's not backlit, you do this type of detail enhancement using Topaz Detail on the medium and the large details, mask it appropriately, and it's going to pop right off the page. Now there will be times when it's not as easy as doing something like you have here on the Pelican, where it's an easy selection to make. Because we started late, I'm not going to go through and show the whole process, but what you can always do if you need to make a mask really easily, coming through, and you know what, I'll go ahead and do it. I can come in right here into Topaz and maybe use Remask. If you don't like learning any of the selection tools in Photoshop, or they're somewhat challenging to use as they may be, in certain circumstances where we've got feathers or hair or fur or something like that, you could go in and easily launch Topaz Remask, and it would get you a really quick solution. Now, just to show how this would work, I use it quite often for those difficult selections, but what you have in the basic layout is I have green that I want to keep, red that I'm going to discard, that is not deselected, and any place there's some type of edge that we need to think about, that's when I'm going to use blue. So I like to come in, I'll turn my whole image into either green or red. I go up and I grab this compute brush. And the compute means that when I go in and outline a particular area, I'm not very good with the mouse today. I much prefer using the Wacom tablet when I'm doing something like this. But I'm going to take that compute brush and just run it right along the edges of my Pelican. And what Remask is going to do here is it will compute this edge and take care of all of the dicey selections. Now my final step would be to go outside of that compute area, and I want to throw away, that is, do not select everything on the outside. It's just that easy. In terms of using a complicated selection tool inside of Photoshop, this one's pretty simple. I use a basic paintbrush to outline the edge, choose what I keep, choose what I get rid of. I'll compute the basic mask. I could go in and refine that more if I needed to, but if I don't, I hit OK. Topaz Remask has created a copy for me of the bird. Then I can easily go in, holding down Control key Windows, Command key on the Mac, I get my selection, and ultimately I can build a targeted detail layer. So whether you use it being comfortable inside of Photoshop selection tools, if you're not, I would highly encourage taking a look at Topaz Remask. I think Nicole said there's a special coming up on that maybe next month. It is a great thing to go to when you have a challenging selection to make. So now that I have my clarity, as well as my high radius, low amount detail, and a little bit of my color correction here, Yeah, looking at the color correction, I kind of like the water being blue and the bird being the a little bit warmer tone, a warmer hue. So what I can do is, since I already have a mask of the pelican, I know, by the way, for my Photoshop users, that is holding on the Alt key on Windows, the Option key on a Mac, and clicking onto the layer mask thumbnail, that will show me the layer mask. But I can take this layer mask, and I can, since I already have it, I don't need to mask the pelican again. I can just copy this up here so that I can exclude the water, and it's going to be a little bit cool, and my bird will stay warm like we did after our color correction. The key to doing that is hold down Alt key on Windows, Option key on the Mac, click and hold, drag up. I'm going to replace that layer mask. Now I have my color adjustment just on the bird, and the water stays nice and cool. So for me, the overall before and after at this point, the Photoshop trick, hold down Alt key, Windows, Option on the Mac, click the layer visibility icon in the background. We go from here to here, a nice little adjustment. If anything, I think I've done a little too much. That's why I do it in Photoshop. I can always go in and pull back that layer opacity just a bit, as I'm doing here with my color correction layer. So for me, we've talked about it here for, I don't know, probably 20 minutes going through this one image. In practice, once you're familiar with the plugins and you start to build a workflow, you can make all of this happen in 2 or 3 minutes. It's somewhat kind of lather, rinse, repeat as you build your workflow. Set that image up inside of Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom's Develop module. Get it to a point where you know you can push perhaps to one of the plugins, maybe clarity, detail. That's kind of my go-to transition from one plugin to the other. Now, if I wanted to take this and push it a little bit further with this image, just to show you one slightly different use of detail that I do all the time. We're gonna pretend here that instead of a master file, what I have is an image that is ready to print. And if this is ready to print, for me it is an output file, and it needs to fall into the output workflow. So to make it look more like an output file, I'm gonna flatten everything, which I would never do to my master file, but I do on output files. I like whatever the aspect ratio is that's set, and I'd go in real quick and I could size my image just for print. Now when I go in and print something, I'm a pretty big fan of never printing anything small. So I'm going to do this at something that would fit on a 13 by 19 sheet of paper. So I'll say, hey, it's a 12 by 15, it's a 202 input resolution. For me, that works perfectly. Much longer discussion talking about input resolution, maybe on a different discussion. But after I've sized my image, then the next step is to do output sharpening. And output sharpening is all about fine detail. Fine detail that we will lose because of going from a relatively high dynamic range monitor over to a lower dynamic range paper. And also, I have a little bit of ink gain as I spray that ink onto the paper, and the dot gain is going to give me the perception that I lose a little bit of sharpness. So because I don't want to have my viewer think that the image wasn't sharp, I will go in and create another detail layer, but this time it is all about the fine details of the image. So I come right back like I did before, coming down to Topaz Labs, right into Detail 3, and if you recall earlier, what we'd set were all the medium and large details. Output sharpening has nothing to do with medium and large details. That's all in the content. Instead, what we're looking at here are the small details. And it's these small details, these are the things that we lose when we go to a printer, based on the dynamic range and the dot gain. For that, I like to get in to a one-to-one view to a critical area of the image. And I'm going to slowly push up those small details. And what I look for is just a subtle change as I'm going before and after. I want it to be barely noticeable. So I really couldn't see much on that, so I'm going to kick it up a little higher. I'm not sure if that's coming across the webinar, but this now is too much output sharpening. It's an iterative process where you add a little bit, maybe a little bit more, and then you come in and back it off. If I ever talk much more about sharpening, I would consider this a Goldilocks sharpening technique where she always wanted something just right. I like the small details being just the right amount where it is just noticeable when I go from one to the other. I'm going to take one question from here in the audience. Go ahead.
What's the difference between the small detail slider and the small detail boost?
So a great question from here live in the audience. What's the difference between small details and the small details boost? That small details boost slider, if you didn't have me to answer it or Nicole wasn't on one of her great webinars, what you can do is come in and hover over any of your sliders, and you're going to find exactly what it is that slider is. So the small details, I like to think of these things, whether it's small details or small details boost, as things that are happening at a very low radius, really fine details within your image. The small details in those are the ones that are relatively easy to see. Stuff like the feather-to-feather transition. Small details boost, this is the stuff that is a little less visible to what I would call the naked eye. So there is some contrast at a very small level back here in the water, potentially in the sky, in human skin. These are things that we don't see automatically as these small details, but if I wanted to kick them up, small details boost is going to pick those up and make them a little more visible. And you can see that as I run the small details boost slider to 1, you see all these details start to show up in the water you could hardly even perceive before. So with small details boost, in general, if you had to use it anywhere, I will rarely move it to the right, especially for output sharpening. I will sometimes move it to the left. Oh, by the way, that's also a trick I will use for some simple skin smoothing techniques if I'm working on a person type shot or people shots. But in most cases, I'll leave that small details boost alone. I don't want to go in and adjust those details. Now, as I say that, if you are comfortable working with masks, I might follow that thing I just said, don't use small details boost. If you are not comfortable with working on a mask, then the small details boost slider is kind of a self-masking option for your sharpening. If you remember just a little bit ago, the second golden rule of sharpening is that all sharpening should be targeted. I only want to target places that have edge contrast or texture detail. The water doesn't have that. So if I don't choose to mask that out, I can take my small details boost slider and move it to the negative side just a little bit. That way it reduces any of that subtle detail that I didn't want to sharpen in the first place, but it doesn't affect the finer, more visible detail that I've already taken care of with the main small details slider on the perk. So it is a nice little self-masking option. It's technically not a self-masking, but it serves the same purpose. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that down because it's already there. I'm going to hit OK. And now I have my output sharpening complete. I'm not going to take the time here because I want to bring up another image, but I would go in and run a mask on this to make sure that even though I use that small details boost on the negative side, I also went in and masked it such that only the bird, only the fine details, the edges, and the texture detail, that's the stuff that receives sharpening. So for me, showing clarity, showing detail, these are two plugins that I use all the time, whether it's working a master file or going in and preparing an output file for print. I'm going to bring open, I'm going to scroll through here. I'm going to bring open just another image and show some things that I might do. And this image I'm opening up here is just a little TIFF that is a HDR that I shot the other night. I processed this in some new beta software that's pretty cool. But one of the things that I really like to use on an HDR is I'll make a choice when I do HDR, and that choice is going to be, do I want to make this realistic? Do I want to make it surrealistic, or where am I going with it? And looking at an image like this, to me, it just, making this look natural, it was such a crazy sight to begin with. I'm going to push this more towards the surreal side. And I'm going to push the colors probably where they weren't in the image. I'm going to bring up local contrast and detail more than was actually there. And what's cool about it is we can. As digital photographers and digital artists, we have the power to do just about anything with our cameras, and especially with the Topaz plugins. So if you happen to see my last Topaz webinar, you know that anytime I'm looking for a special effect or something that is going to give me a little bit of a surreal effect, I always use Topaz Adjust. This is one that goes hand in hand with me for my HDR, but I don't need to be that kind of realistic effect. I want to push it a little bit different. Now, there are many folks that will use adjust in a very gentle manner to keep things realistic. I'm typically not one of those. When I want to kick things up a little bit and keep it very realistic, that's where Topaz Clarity really shines for me. But when I want to push it a little bit, adjust is there, and it does it typically with just a single click. Looking at the interface on Topaz Adjust, it is very similar to what we had before. It's very comforting going from plug-in to plug-in, and I'm looking at the same interface. So over on the left, I like within the stylized collection. The stylized collection does include many different presets that allow me to, that are titled HDR. Pardon me, actually those are drafted in the wrong one. If I go to my HDR collection, it's custom made by Nicole and Company to work on HDR. So looking at these, and I'm just going to hide my right panel because I rarely go in and make adjustments to this. I might come in and say, all right, let's try through them. And the great thing is that they're one-click shopping. What do I want to get out of that image? Where do I want to push it today? Do I want to emphasize the color that was out there? Do I want to emphasize the detail? Can I get a little bit of both? And the answer is with Adjust, you can get just about anything you want. And most of the time, you get it strictly by clicking onto one of the presets. So I'm going to go in here, and I kind of like this medium pop grunge thing. I think it looks neat. It's a nice little balance between pushing the color and getting a little extra detail in the image. My intention to push this a little more towards the surreal. With that set up, I'll just hit OK. That's going to process the image, and it'll take me right back over to Photoshop, and I can continue to take this image into some other places. So looking at this real quick, go a little before and after on the adjust. The one thing that I don't necessarily like about where this image is right now is that I have very little contrast right here on the rock itself. To me, one of the best ways to build contrast in an image, although I'm going somewhat surreal, is to use Topaz Clarity. So normally I use Clarity on things that I really want to be realistic, but it has such a great tool set that I'm going to use it here to kick up the contrast in what's becoming a piece of photo art. So I'll go back to Clarity real quick. So maybe I can work my mouse. And back in Clarity, this is one of those times what I'm really going to do is I want to work this manually. And I'm going to ignore everything else that's happening in the image and concentrate strictly on what's going on right here. So things that I'm thinking, there's probably a little bit of micro contrast in there. I'm going to kick that up a bit. Notice how that changes the rock. It puts contrast into the rock where there wasn't any before. I kind of like that. Maybe add a little bit of that low contrast to kick it up even more. And that looks pretty good. Now I have a choice here. I know that I want this clarity adjustment to only be on the rock. So I could mask this out in Photoshop. But if you happen to not be working Photoshop, with Topaz Clarity, you have some pretty amazing masking capability. In fact, a lot of what happens here is better than what happens in Photoshop working on masks because of the different brush options that Topaz gave us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this mask and I'm first going to switch it from white to black, which hides everything. Then I'm going to take my brush, make it just a simple normal brush, hardness so it's nice and soft. Once I've switched to a conceal all or a hide mask, I could go in and easily begin to reveal this effect just on the rock. And doing that inside of Clarity is really pretty cool. One, I think that some of the, really the edge-aware brush is better than what I get in almost any of the Adobe products. But also, if you don't have Photoshop, or if you don't understand the layers and the masks, I can get in and do this inside of strictly Topaz Clarity. So now that I have that mask built, you may want to go back in and say, well, do I need a little bit more of that micro or low contrast to get me where I need to be? So there, the rock now, I think, matches what's going on in the rest of the image. So I'll hit OK and bring myself right back over here to Photoshop and move forward in this process. Now, I could have done, if you're really comfortable using the Photoshop masking, you could certainly do that there. But I'll tell you, when I'm inside of Clarity and I want to mask, as much as I like using Photoshop, the mask tools in Clarity are really pretty slick. So what we've got so far, holding that Alt or Option key, so before, after, and we've kicked it up just a little bit. Now, if I wanted to go any further with this, I certainly could. And because we lost that little bit of time, I would show you my next step, which to me, once I made this even a little crazier, would be, yeah, you know, I kind of like what's going on, but what it seems like to me is it really needs to be some type of drawing or painting or some kind of illustration is what this feels like to me. So, because really when I look in here and I get in real tight, I've been pretty aggressive with this, and it looks a little bit grungy, so I'm going to push it even further. And when I look to make some type of illustration, I mentioned this last time I was on, what's it called? Topaz Clean really is kind of my go-to. There are some things in photography I find myself really good at. There are others not so much. And anything involved brushing or painting, I'm not real good at. Love coming into something like Topaz Clean, which I can come in and choose one of the presets and then get in and manipulate things just a little bit more. The one that I really like to use, I showed it last time, I'm kind of, I guess, addicted to it right now, is this option of something called, it's Curly Smooth is the preset. And then I can easily come in and adjust what's going on here on the right. I like to start, for whatever reason, with the edges, and we don't have the time to go through a full clean tutorial, but I like to kick it up. I'm going to accent those edges. I'll bring my radius down, sharpen it up a little bit, maybe not so much. And then once I have my edges, I'll actually come back up to the clean options. I tend to bring the strength down. So that allows more of the underlying detail in the image to come in. So now I have a little bit more of that. So now I have this kind of line drawing, artistic interpretation of an HDR that I pushed surrealistic, that people would catch that. They'd say, well, yeah, that's not a very good interpretation of what it looked like out there. And you're absolutely right. That wasn't the intention. But now, if I push this to be and I'm going to hit OK so we can look at this at a different level in Photoshop, I push this now to an illustration that I find to be actually pretty cool. And I could use this for a lot of different things. My intention, I did this image the other day using this exact technique. And what I did is I ended up cropping it to an 8.5 by 11 and making it a mock cover for some of the things that go on here inside of, or in and around Morro Bay. So if I bring that image in, you know, so looking at some of the stuff we have over there, I find that didn't work. I find that to be a pretty cool interpretation from a quick grab shot that I had one day at sunset and testing out some new HDR software. So regardless of where I want to go with an image, being able to start that basic background, kick it up with Topaz Adjust, add some clarity to that area in the rock that didn't have initially, and then finally push it to be illustrative so people know I'm not trying to fool you. I'm not trying to say, hey, it really looked like this. This is more an artistic interpretation. It's a graphic novelesque feel, and I absolutely love using Topaz Clean for exactly that. When you really get into clean, you'll find that you can do more, and you can get in, use it for skin smoothing, edge contrast enhancement, all sorts of really great stuff using Topaz Clean. So I'm probably done with my time that Nicole has for me, especially with a couple technical difficulties today. So I'm going to turn it back over to her in just a moment, or maybe some time for hopefully questions. But for me, everything is Topaz. I have started using almost every single plugin, and although you might have seen a couple of other plugins on my machine, I don't typically use those in my workflow. Whether I'm going realistic or surrealistic, anywhere in between, I'm almost exclusive Topaz when using the plugins because I love the simplicity, I love the speed, I love the accuracy of the processing, especially when I want to do something realistic. The fine detail adjustment that I have is awesome, and I retain a level of reality that I just don't get with any other plugin. So, Nicole, over to you. Any questions we got?
So I do have a couple questions. I don't know. I think your audience can actually hear me. So if you just want to repeat, we'll just try to answer as many questions we can in 3 minutes, and then
Okay.
I'll announce the winner of the Topaz collection.
Sounds awesome.
All right. So Maria asks, I use Lightroom and Restyle. Why would I need Adjust?
So if you're using Lightroom and Restyle, why would you need Adjust? You know, Restyle is awesome. It is one of my new favorite plugins. And what I like about Adjust is that, well, I'll frame both of these. Restyle, if you haven't looked at the plugin itself, that Restyle goes through and it maps out the tonality of your image, and it changes the tonal range and the contrast of each of those tonal regions, then maps it to a specific color. And I can use that to get some really great interpretations, honestly, things that I never even thought of, and I wouldn't think of. And I take a finished file, push it over into Restyle. What I find with Topaz Adjust is when I want to push surrealistic and then do things for, as I mentioned today, more of a special effect, I find that not only the presets, but the controls inside of Topaz Adjust give me substantially more control than I get inside of Restyle. Restyle has 1,000 different presets, and they're all there, and most of them usually work pretty well. And I can move through, find my favorites, and find one that works. But when I want to start from the baseline and create my own special effect or kick something up surrealistic, there is nothing like using the Adjust controls that allow me to go in and modify the saturation, dynamic saturation, contrast, dynamic contrast, all sorts of stuff to make sure that I can get exactly what I want. Interestingly, sometimes I'll push an image into Adjust and then send it over to Restyle to see what else did I not think of. Just for giggles as we're talking to it here, perhaps we could take a look and what if I took this image here that we've done everything else inside of, and if I drop that over to Restyle, what would we get? That's one of the neat things I love about digital is that we can just play around. Once I've got everything into the software and the stuff is on my machine, I can go in and here let's see. I'll bring up my grid view. I could go through and try really just about anything and see, okay, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. And the great thing is I can do all of these different things inside of Restyle. It's the click of a button. I can adjust them if I like, but I wouldn't have thought to do this on my own. I probably would never have taken the Seashell Pink Mist color palette and applied it to this. I typically don't think in those color palettes. But to me, it's something that it can get in and really boost my creativity. And I find myself using it a huge amount. But hopefully that's kind of a long-winded answer, but it shows that they both have their place, really just depending upon what you want out of the image.
Well, thank you. No, that was a very thorough answer. So I think that covered it well, and you showed off Restyle, so thank you.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
Yeah, I have a lot of fun with that one. Thank you so much, Hal. Really appreciate you taking the time during your festival to invite us in to do this live session with you. So,
Well, thanks, Nicole, for having us.
Thank you so much again, and we'll be talking to you soon. Bye, everyone.